quick. I'm going to just run through the format and then we're going to get started. So the plan here is we've got 7 panel questions that we're going to ask. After we've asked those 7 panel questions, we're going to ask some questions from the audience. We're not going to be taking the questions directly from the audience, but what we're going to ask you to do is write them down. If you have any questions, or if you have any questions you want to ask at any point, just raise your hand. We'll get it passed out to you. Write it down. It'll get turned in right over here to Erin at the table. The idea is 4 or 5 people probably going to have the same question. So we're going to kind of word it into one question for the candidate. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to welcome up to the podium our next guest, Abdul El Sayed.
All right, good evening.
Good evening.
I'm honored and I'm privileged to be here with you tonight. I want to tell you, I know I don't look like the usual candidate for governor. After a lot of my more established Democratic friends say, you know, Abdul, it's not that we disagree with what you have to say. It's just that you're a little bit young. You're also a little bit brown and a little bit Muslim. How's that going to work out for you? Let me tell you why I'm running. I'm a doctor. And I had the privilege of rebuilding Detroit's health department after it had been shut down when the city was facing bankruptcy and Rick Snyder rolled through with his emergency managers. They made the decision to shut down a 185-year-old health department in a city with a higher infant mortality rate than my father's native Egypt. A city where our children face 3-fold the probability of being hospitalized for asthma, 4-fold the probability of being exposed to lead than the state average. They shut down a 185-year-old health department. I was hired to rebuild that health department. We thought outside the box. We wanted to break down the barriers that kids had to being able to learn and earn in Detroit like we would want for any child anywhere. We did things like build a program to guarantee every child a free pair of glasses delivered at school within 2 weeks of a vision test. And we did it because we found that 30% of our kids wouldn't get a pair of glasses even though we tested them and knew they needed a pair, sitting in the back of the class without the ability to see the blackboard. When Marathon Petroleum, the biggest polluter in the most polluted zip code in the entire state of Michigan, when they wanted to raise their emissions of sulfur dioxide, we stood up. We said enough is enough, and we organized with the local community, and together we forced them to invest $10 million of their own money to reduce their emissions when they had wanted to increase them. And then we heard about Flint. And I had just finished inspecting city schools, saw first graders trying to color between the lines with gloves on their hands. And we realized that our kids could be exposed to the same lead we were hearing about in Flint in their schools, the single place where we systematically concentrate our most vulnerable most of the day, most of the year. So we had every school, daycare, and Head Start tested for lead in the water, tested all 360 buildings in 6 months, created a protocol that is now model practice nationwide for how you get lead out of school water. But every project that we took on, every single one, led us to the door of a politician. And those doors are always closed for people like you and me. Because they only open for the corporations who pay the checks into their re-election campaigns. Now, I've been now to over 120 cities across the state. No matter where I go, when you talk to poor or working or retired people in places like Detroit or Flint, or poor or working or retired people in places like Kalkaska or Marquette up in the UP, they're talking about the same issues. Why is our auto insurance so expensive? Why is it that people have to choose between getting the care they need when they get sick or putting their family's financial future in ruin because we have not stood up for universal health care? Why do our seniors in this country pay more for prescription drugs than any other country in the world? Why do we allow folks like Nestle to bottle our water for $400 a year while folks in communities across the state have to pay $400 a month and face water shutoffs if they can't pay it? Why does Flint still not have clean water? When are we going to stand up to that Betsy DeVos agenda that says that we should allow corporations to make money off of our schools? When are we going to stand up for $15 and a union? These are the questions that bring us all together. Now, all of those challenges, every single one, is just a symptom. of a broader disease, and that's a broken politics. A politics that has been bought and sold by corporations for far too long. I hate to say it. We all know that the GOP is bought out. Bill Shooty, brought to you by Dow Chemical. But more Democrats than we'd like to admit are playing by the same exact set of rules. And worse, we could come together. We could find that common ground. We could build that Michigan we believe in, but we've been paralyzed by a culture of fear that tells us that we cannot see eye to eye with people who see the world differently than we do. We retreat to our own echo chambers where everybody looks and sounds and acts just like we do. We've got an opportunity in 2018, and that opportunity is to hold fast to the ideal of what this country was always supposed to be. A place where there might survive a government for people and by people. Not for money and by money, not for corporations and by corporations, for people and by people. That is the movement we're building. We have raised well over $3 million, all in individual contributions, without taking a dime of corporate money. 4,000 active volunteers, knocking doors, making phone calls, sending text messages to talk about a movement that they believe in. This is what this is about, and we have that opportunity if we come together in 2018. I look forward to working with you toward that goal. Thank you.
Our state took a chance on a CEO with no political experience in 2010, and we have suffered as a state because of it. Our country took a chance on a CEO with no experience in 2016, and we all know how that's going. How important is past political experience, and why should we take another gamble with you?
Well, I'll tell you, we definitely can't take a gamble on a CEO with no experience. I'm the only person in this race on the left who has any executive experience in government whatsoever. I rebuilt the health department in the poorest city in America, in post-bankruptcy Detroit. In that role, I had the opportunity to work with everybody from the mayor's office to city council, so I understand how municipal politics work, to work with folks in the governor's office, Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, the state legislature, so I understand how state government works, and to work with folks in the president's office, with the CDC, HHS, and our congressional corps and our senators. So I understand how federal government works. And in that role, we delivered. We were able to make sure that every kid in Detroit got a pair of glasses, to stand up to some of the biggest corporate polluters in the state, to make sure that our kids weren't drinking lead in the water, coordinating with multiple units of government to solve problems. And the fact is that if it's about political experience, then the question is, if running a campaign can elevate somebody who's never run for office before to the gubernatorial ranks in this state, then it says something about what we can do in politics. But that's the wrong question. The right question is, who has the right government experience? Because the person we elect is going to be the person who's responsible for the 50,000 person bureaucracy and $56 billion budget of this state. And you want somebody who understands what it means to work in government, to achieve outcomes for the people that he or she serves in government, and understands what it means to underwrite when bad things happen. And I'll just finish on this note. Imagine what would have happened in Flint if our governor had been a doctor with public health experience, and with the experience of having served at the municipal level, and with the experience of knowing what it means to be where the buck stops. That's been my experience in government, and I believe that for that reason, I'm actually the best prepared candidate for governor in this race.
Climate change is a real and present danger to our planet. We need to make changes, and they are not going to happen on a national level anytime soon. What specifically will you do to make sure that Michigan is a leader in green energy?
Yeah. So I want to talk about what I have done, and then I'll talk about what I will do. Oftentimes when we talk about climate change, it's easy to externalize the problem. It's easy to imagine that the challenge with climate change is something about polar bears up on the melting polar ice caps. And while we all love polar bears, let's be clear, there's a lot of issues we got to take care of at home. And so it makes it seem far away. But when we talk about climate change in our communities, what we have to be talking about is the fact that every time we burn an ounce of fossil fuel, we are putting stuff into the lungs of our children, into the water that they drink. that they should not be exposed to. That is why, as a public health doctor, leading on environmental issues was so critical for me. It wasn't just marathon patrolling we stood up to. It wasn't just the fact that we made sure our kids were not exposed to lead in their schools. It was the fact that we negotiated with US Ecology when they wanted to bring in fracking waste in the city of Detroit, and we said, no way. But we stood up to them. When Waterfront Petroleum wanted to store piles of this stuff called metallurgical coke on the riverfront without being covered, we stood up. And on the back of my testimony to the Board of Zoning Appeals, we won a 9-0 decision to force them to cover that stuff, and it's still not on the riverfront because of it. And in view of that work, I was awarded Public Official of the Year by the League of Conservation Voters. But the fact is, it's not about awards. The asthma burden in cities like Detroit is threefold the state average. A child with mild persistent asthma is likely to miss 1 school day every 2 weeks. Imagine trying just to achieve like your classmates when you have to miss a day every 2 weeks because you wake up and you can't breathe. This is about what happens here at home, protecting our air and our water. We have proposed that we make Michigan a state where we are committed to 100% renewable energy by 2050. The way we do that is that we need to stand up to the monopolies of DTE and consumers' energy. We need to invest in the infrastructure that we need to harvest renewable energy, and we need a system for financing. So we would push for legislation that would allow our individuals, everyday people, to harvest renewable energy and to do what's called net metering. Basically, charge DTE for the energy that they are harvesting on behalf of everybody. They can sell that back to the grid. But then, to be able to build out the infrastructure that they need, the solar panels, the wind turbines, we've proposed a pure Michigan infrastructure bank. What this bank would do would finance those kinds of projects. And over the long term, through that financing, empower everyday people to harvest renewable energy while breaking the monopoly that these non-renewable energy sources, consumers and DTE, often have. Also, we can work with them because the bank would not just finance everyday people, but could also finance those infrastructure investments on behalf of DTE, consumers, and anybody else. So we have an opportunity right now, not just to remind ourselves why this matters so much, but also to think about how we get it done. And I know there's a way forward if we're willing to stand up to the corporations. I'm not taking money from DTE and consumers, and we're willing to think outside the box about how we finance the harvesting of renewable energy and break that chokehold.
Macomb County is growing in a diversity every year. However, we have not seen corresponding growth in diversity among our elected officials. How important is diversity to you? And how do you see yourself working to improve diversity among Michigan, Macomb County elected officials?
I really appreciate the question. So I would be remiss not to point out my better half, who is Sarah. If you would just wave. So Sarah and I live in Shelby Township, in the house that she grew up in. We, in fact, just had a baby girl about 6 months ago. And Sarah and I often reflect on the experience of being, quote unquote, the only, right? You know, the only people, and you name the unit, that look like you, right? Or have a name like yours, or pray like you do. Diversity is incredibly important to me. And not just because, you know, I am not the usual candidate for governor for a lot of reasons that are obvious and less obvious, but also because when we have perspectives on a problem that look at that problem in a different way, we get better answers. And so when I was health director in the city of Detroit, I wanted to make sure that the people who were helping me to make big decisions were people who represented the diversity of viewpoints around the city. And so, you know, I'm very thankful that my deputy director at the health department was an African-American lesbian woman. Somebody who showed me the world in a way that I would not otherwise have seen it as an Arab-American, Muslim, cis, straight man. And the fact is that oftentimes she could see that world and help us to come to a better decision because of it. And so I know that in my cabinet, it is critically important that my cabinet reflect the diversity of our state. I've already made the commitment that at least 50% of my cabinet will be women. But then I also want my cabinet, when it comes to racial and ethnic breakdown, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability status, that it reflect our really diverse state. And I think it's critical also that, you know, for me, I'll be honest with you, the first person ever to tell me run for office was President Clinton. And I was at my college commencement, I was the senior speaker, and I was the valedictorian in my class, and President Clinton was the main speaker. And he came up to me after my speech and asked me why I was going to medical school. I told him, well, I'm Muslim, that's just what we do. But beyond that, I said, look, I love people and I love science. And he looks at me and he says, you know, you have a real gift for communicating. Maybe someday you'll run for office. And I looked at him, I said, I don't know if you saw my first name, Mr. President, but there are 11 letters in my first name, and that's just the first name. People like me don't get to get elected. That's how I was thinking about it. A year after that, I had the opportunity to watch a man by the name of Barack Hussein Obama get elected president of the United States. Somebody who I would have, in my worldview, would have thought would have been impossible to be elected. And so I like to think that on the best days, just my running empowers people who believe that there is no way possible for them to get elected in a particular place to see themselves in a politician. Because I know what it was like to see myself in a politician for the first time in somebody like Barack Obama. And I do hope that we can do a lot of work to bring diversity into this Democratic Party. Because we talk a good game about diversity. But let's be clear, the number of times I've been told by party leadership, right, and people who are strong in the party that you seem great, but you just can't win because you're X, right? I don't want anybody to have to face that in the future. We need a party where we say, you know what, you bring a diverse perspective on this, you belong in this coalition, and we need to be meritocratic about bringing our best and brightest to the fore as candidates for elected office and elected officials, and I know I'm committed to that.
Mr. El Sayed, auto insurance rates are out of control with no relief in sight. Southern Macomb County is especially impacted by this due to our proximity to Detroit. What will you do to help lower the cost of auto insurance?
Yeah, so we've got a reverse the rates plan that's coming out on Thursday, and I'm really excited about announcing it. And there are 3 parts to it. The first is that we have to end redlining. Let's be clear. Right now, it is legal for auto insurers to use information about where you live, about what your profession is, about what your education level is, about whether or not you're married, about your credit score, to make decisions about how much you pay. To me, the only 2 things that should matter is, are you over or under the age of 25? And what is your driving record? Those are the only 2 issues. So we need to end any form of redlining. That's number 1. Number 2, we are proposing a Truth in Insurance Commission. Truth in Insurance would be a group appointed, people like you and me, who stand up to those insurers and hold them accountable and make sure that they are transparent. How much money did you make last year? What are your rates? How much money sits in that catastrophic claims fund? Because without transparency and without accountability, what do we have? And then third, we proposed a comprehensive healthcare reform package last week. It's called MichiCare. If we were able to pass MichiCare, it would drop the rates of auto insurance somewhere between 50 and 70%. Why? Because in our current system, we ask auto insurance to be health insurance too. And if we just make sure that everybody has health insurance, well then, auto insurance can go back to being auto insurance, and health insurance can be health insurance. But right now, we've got the whole thing mixed up. And so we need to stand up for comprehensive healthcare reform to get to comprehensive auto insurance reform. But in the interim, it also means that we are holding lawyers accountable. Right now, they ambulance chase in a way that is profound and exploitative. And we're holding hospitals accountable. They bill auto insurance at a rate that's far greater than what they bill for health insurance. And we've got to make sure that they are held honest to what they do. And so holding them accountable, holding the insurance accountable, and making sure that we don't have a system of redlining and that we're empowering accountability and transparency, that's the way that we reform auto insurance, bring down the rates, and make sure that folks don't have to pay thousands of dollars a year for services that they don't use.
Macomb County roads.
I drive up and down Mount Road every day.
Total despair. An unconscionably unfair system funding hurts counties like Macomb in favor of more Republican area of state. What specific ideas do you have to both, 1, increase overall road funding, and 2, correct the formulas so that Macomb County receive its fair share of funding?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like I said, we drive up and down Mountain Road every day. I've got a little Ford Focus, and we put a lot of miles on that Focus. Too many of them are like mound miles, which are like 5 times the normal mile. And so road funding is something I thought a lot about. But I want to get to something first before I answer your specific questions. In Michigan right now, we have to remind ourselves that our biggest competition is for our own talent, our young people to want, A, to build them, and then B, to keep them here. And a lot of young people don't want to stay in communities like ours because we haven't done the work of connecting our major metropolitan areas together. And so road funding is only part of the problem. The other part of the problem is we've got to ask ourselves how we build comprehensive mass transit. So we've proposed, as I said, a pure Michigan infrastructure bank. That bank would work on 4 different aspects of infrastructure that matter a lot. I already talked about renewable energy, but a second one of them is transit. And what this infrastructure bank allows us to do is to cut this system whereby we always think about the fix in February and March, put a Band-Aid on it, and then leave it until next February and March where it's even worse than the next year. What the bank would allow us to do is fund long-term projects in a very systematic way, and then do so in a way that empowers big, long-term kinds of projects. So yes, we can build our roads, but also how do we invest in the mass transit system? And then the other question is, how do we pay for it? Well, right now, look, the single biggest or most disproportionate investment that needs to be made in roads needs to be made by multiple axle trucking vehicles, right? We know corporations move their stuff through Michigan and often to our international ports, and then we all are left to pay that in our gas tax, right? And I just believe that those corporations should be paying their fair share if they're going to truck their materials through Michigan. And then I think you're right? Right now we fund per mile, and let's be clear, if you're in a rural area, that mile is not getting nearly the use as Mountain Road is getting used, right? And so I believe that we need to do a much deeper dive study on the use of roads, and then think about a formula that actually funds over car traffic rather than just on miles.
Mr. El Sayed, perhaps your biggest liability here in Macomb County, if not throughout the state, are questions surrounding your eligibility and your campaign's response to those questions. Referring to individuals with questions about your residency as birthers was a step too far for many. Do you regret this response, and how would you move past its heading into the fall?
Well, I am happy to announce that I am officially eligible. I actually signed off on like 40 different ballots today. So you will see my name on the ballot, and that's pretty awesome. I'll be honest, right, when that came through, the frustration was that it's a question that you can never really shake. Because there's always something that somebody's going to push back on and say, well, there's one more hurdle. Somebody could still ask questions about whether or not you're eligible. And so in that light, it did feel a lot like the kind of attack that you can't ever really shake. And I do think that looking back at it, I think we should have let that situation play out. And I've learned a lot about how to deal with those kinds of attacks from political opponents. I'll be honest, I think where we have to focus right now is always on how do we make sure that we are empowering voters at the ballot box to have the right choice? And how do we move beyond a politics where an opponent will seek to undercut somebody based on something that is largely hearsay rather than facts and figures about where that person stands? And I'll be honest, when that attack came, what we were so frustrated about was that we knew that there were questions that could have arisen, but they were played out in the court of public opinion rather than the court of law. And we actually went as far as to sue the state of Michigan to prove that I was eligible. But the fact is that we didn't have standing to do it until far later in the system. So it's the kind of attack you actually can't defend, right? Because you don't even have recourse to play it out in the court of law rather than the court of public opinion. So ultimately, we're really thankful that the state of Michigan has vindicated me. I'm 100% eligible to run for governor. And we're focused on the conversations we've shared with Michiganders all over the state about how we fix roads, how we provide health care, cut the rate of auto insurance, and rebuild our public schools. And that's what we're focused on 100%.
Thank you, All right, Mr. El Sayed. When individuals run for office, it's easy to talk to the base, and actually you may have touched on a few answers to this question already. So you've throw out the red meat, claim to stand for the things the party believes in. What's hard is putting in the work and fighting for change. Without mentioning policies you hope to enact. Can you name 3 things, and if you have any in mind that you haven't already mentioned, that'd be great, that you've done in your past to help enact the democratic or progressive agenda, ways you've been involved in the party?
Sure. So I already talked about standing up to big corporate polluters. I talked about making sure our kids had glasses. I talked about making sure that our kids were not poisoned by lead in their schools. But there's a lot of other work. I walked into a municipal health department that had been shut down because of emergency management. And in my role there, I had the unique opportunity and responsibility to rebuild an agency that is fundamental to the well-being of young people. And I knew that the way we built that department was going to be indelible for the future. And so we gave a lot of thought to 2 things. Number one, how do we build it responsibly and in a direction to innovate for what public health ought to be for the future, right? And then number 2, how do we create the kind of institution that can bring people together and can lead conversations and engage itself in the political space, because public health is political. And so we took that department from 5 employees and 85 contractors in the back of the building where people pay parking tickets in Detroit, and we rebuilt it to 220 overall, multiplied city funding for public health 10 times, and set us on a path where we as a department had a central goal of breaking down the barriers that kids had to being able to learn and earn. And what we established is not only the precedent, but the capacity for that department to engage in conversations and organize the public around issues that matter a lot. We enrolled people into ACA coverage. In fact, the city of Detroit was number 4 nationally when there was a huge drive back in 2015. It was one of the first things that we did. We were enrolling people into the ACA at McDonald's, Tim Hortons drive-thrus. We were everywhere, right, trying to get people access to healthcare. And so, specific answers to that question would be rebuilding an agency and showing what that agency can do as a functioning part of municipal government after emergency management, standing up to make sure that people had access to basic health care, and then establishing a way forward where we take agencies and not explicitly engage in health, but in politics, but engage in civic engagement and use that agency as a space that empowers people to stand up for their own rights, which I think are fundamental to the Democratic Party core and our message.
Okay, now we're going to move on to a couple of the questions from the audience. We asked this question last time around as well. I'm afraid to die and leave my son in a broken mental health system. Macomb County had $40 million of funding cut. MCCMH has been lobbying to regain $7 million of that out of desperation, but they lost that fight today. Pilot programs and privatization have been the game. What will you do to provide service to the disabled?
I really appreciate the question. So another thing about Sarah, my better half, is that she's a psychiatry resident. And so, as 2 doctors and folks who care a lot about the future of this state, we talk a lot about the very broken mental health system. And let's just review some history for a second. There was a movement in the 70s and 80s to shut down these big inpatient psychiatric hospitals to build outpatient psychiatric institutions. The idea being, and a very respectable idea, being that a lot of these folks, because of improvements in treatment, could get outpatient treatment and live functional lives out in the community. But in our state, when that came through, it was under the Engler administration. And instead of building the requisite outpatient mental health supports that we needed, they passed a tax cut. And so people went without access to basic mental health services. So right now, we neither have the inpatient psychiatric units that we need, nor the outpatient psychiatric institutions that we need. And it's particularly acute because we are dealing with one of the worst substance abuse crises since the 1980s, which is the opioid epidemic. And we've got a responsibility to build out the infrastructure that we need. What's worse is that Republicans right now are trying to privatize the entire mental health infrastructure. And that's exactly why we're starting to see these kinds of cuts. They've moved to a block granting system, and that block granting system is just the next step to being able to just cut the whole thing. And so we need a big bet investment in mental illness and mental health support. That means both investing more, that means building the kind of infrastructure, both inpatient and outpatient, that we need. It means investing in new technologies. We can do a lot of telepsychiatry today in ways that we couldn't in the past. How do we use these new tools to give people access to the services that they need? It means changes in legislation, particularly around the legality of substances and the way that we think about substances. Let's be clear, the opioid epidemic is, yes, the biggest substance abuse epidemic in the last 30 years, but the last time we saw this, it was crack. And because it took hold in low-income urban Black communities, instead of dealing with it with the kind of empathy that I think we're starting to see now around opioids, we criminalized, right? So we have a whole set of war on drugs legislation that continue to ravage low-income communities all over the state of Michigan, frankly, all over the country. And so if we want to be serious about investing in mental health, it means we've got to go back and correct where we were wrong, build that kind of empathy into the structures and the legislation that we use to deal with the kinds of epidemics we're dealing with now, and we need to invest. We just absolutely need to invest. So one of the most important aspects of MichiCare is that it would empower access to mental health support for every Michigander in the state. And because we would do that, rather than just funding mental illness like the brain is not actually part of the body, right? It allows us to think about the whole patient and to streamline the kinds of support that we can offer to patients across the board. And so this would be a revolution in the way that we invest in mental health care, particularly in communities that are being ravaged by the opioid epidemic.
Should recreational marijuana pass, we can expect tax revenue. What path do you see for this statewide revenue to be spent? And if it passes, what is your opinion on releasing those convicted of marijuana possession?
Yeah, let me just speak on the second question first. There is no doubt that if this passes, we need to stand up and expunge records for folks with nonviolent offenses related to marijuana. That's just a fact. Let's talk a little bit about where that money is going to go. It's estimated to be about $125 million. Right now, if we were to pass marijuana legalization, the bill that the referendum that we would pass actually stipulates where that money would go. And part of it goes into roads, and part of it goes into schools. I'll be honest with you though, I actually think that a lot of that money ought to be able to go into the general fund. And what that general fund would do, because general fund money is not earmarked in the same ways that specific allocations are earmarked. And what that will allow us to do is to think about how we invest rather than in the buckets of money that we have right now into new innovative projects. One of the things that I think we need to focus on, for example, is universal pre-K, right? Access to an education when you are your best learner between the ages of 3 and 5 should be something that every young person in Michigan has access to. We can fund it, we want to fund it through an early childhood tax credit. I do think that that would be a great place for that funding to go. And when we think about investments into our roads, to me, funding an infrastructure bank that allows you to attract private capital into your public goods and also allows you to package your money for larger projects is a very, very smart use of that money. So I do believe in investing in infrastructure, I do believe in investing in education, but I think we got to think outside the box, right? The other part of this is that let's talk about where other money is coming from. $125 million in a $56 billion pot is a drop in the bucket, right? We need to get serious in the state about holding corporations accountable to pay their fair share. And right now, we as a state, right, we offer billions of dollars in tax subsidies to these huge corporations expecting that they actually create jobs. You all know how many net jobs the Fortune 500 corporations actually created in the last 10 years? 0. And the fact is that a lot of that investment, those subsidies, go into helping to automate out the jobs that we're expecting to come through. And so we've got to hold them accountable to be able to bring those billions of dollars back into state resources to invest big bet in things like education, things like infrastructure, things like water infrastructure in particular. That's, I think, the way that we really do the investments, because $125 million, while really important, relative to a $56 billion budget, is just not going to cut it. We've got to make sure corporations pay their fair share. That's how we invest in our schools, in our infrastructure, and in our water, and in our healthcare. the many things that we need to provide Michiganders for them to be able to thrive and to build into the future.
How do you plan to overcome the inevitable resistance of for-profit insurance companies to a single-payer health insurance system? And I think this is important, there are a lot of employees of those systems, including a lot of working people, secretaries, paperwork pushers, a lot of people that rely on those companies for their income. What is your plan in regards to putting those people to work if you put those companies out of business?
Let's answer the second part first. Those jobs are going to exist. They're just going to exist in a very different way. Rather than working for a for-profit corporation where they're taking 15% off the top of every transaction in healthcare and their CEO is making $13 million, those become really good paying quality state jobs, right? Being able to provide healthcare to every Michigander. And I've spoken to many people who work for companies like Blue Cross or HAP or Meridian, and they say, you know what, I'll tell you, I know that what our company does hurts a lot of people. I would love to be able to do my job in a situation where I know that I'm a part of providing every Michigander access to the healthcare that they need. And let's be clear, right? Those for-profit insurance companies are already opposing my campaign. I've got an opponent who's taking money hand over fist from the insurance industry. Why? Because that insurance industry knows that they benefit the status quo through that candidate, right? And they'll tell you, right, they will push hard in a public relations campaign to say that it's impossible. We can't do it. It's going to be too expensive. It's crazy talk. Fact is, if we were to drive from here to the riverfront, which is not all that far, across the river you see a society where they're able to provide every person in their society access to high quality health care. They spend 11 cents on the dollar relative to our 19 cents on the dollar. They live a year and a half longer and they're all happier with the health care that they have. And so the fact is, I literally just met a guy. He married a Canadian woman. And they sat down and they said, what is our taxes in America? What's our taxes in Canada? Let's include the cost of health insurance in America, because in Canada, that's free. And you know what they decided to do? They don't live in Detroit, they live in Windsor. Because they don't have to worry about their health care. That's a young couple. We just lost them. They don't pay any taxes for us anymore, right? They both work across the river, but because she's Canadian, they get access to that health insurance for free. It's a fact. We can do better. And so this is about standing up for Michiganders against the for-profit corporations, right, whose CEOs make millions upon millions of dollars because you pay co-pays, you pay premiums, you pay deductibles, and every time you even want to get the services that you actually paid for in the first place, you got to get on the phone and call them, and they'll give you a bunch of stuff about why it's not in network, it's out of network, it's not covered, your co-pay was too little. It's ridiculous. The whole system's ridiculous. Michiganders are done with it. And so, yes, we are going to actually have to push forward in a battle of messaging for the hearts and minds of Michiganders. But the fact is that the facts are on our side, right? They're going to spend a ton of money in commercials trying to tell everybody why this is the worst. But the fact is, it's what's right for Michiganders. And so we need leadership that's willing to take on those battles to be able to provide something as critical and fundamental as access to health care when you get sick for Michiganders across the state. And I'll be honest with you, I go all over the state, 120 different cities now. And no matter where I go, healthcare is one of the biggest issues that people talk about. We all know the system's broken. We've got a solution to fix it. It's going to take a lot of work to getting there, but I know we can do it. And you know what? If that means that we're going to take on a bunch of for-profit CEOs to do it, I'm happy to take that on because it's what's right for Michiganders. And I'll tell you, as somebody who through medical school took care of patients, I took an oath that said that I would always fight for people who are sick. And I'm not going to let that down in this role.
One more question, and then we'll let you get to your closing statement. Working people in this country are under attack, whether it be right to work, whether it be repealing the prevailing wage. Unions have been hit left and right and simply treated as punching bag. I think that we dropped the ball in 2008 when we had a Democratic president, the Democratic House, and the Democratic Senate by not putting the first thing on the agenda, strengthening unions. Will you promise that the first thing as governor you would do is strengthen unions? And can you tell us what you would do specifically to make that happen?
Yeah. So a union is one of the most important tools that working people have to be able to stand up to corporations who have more than gotten their fair share. And if we want to put working people first, then it means that we have to make a big bet commitment to unions. My stance with unions is unabashed, and it has started before I ever decided to run for office. In fact, I'm proud that when I was health commissioner in Detroit, I got to work with a Teamsters local that represented our animal control officers. They hadn't had a raise for 10 years, and we sat down, we negotiated them a 25% raise from $12 an hour to $16 an hour. And they were able to turn around and reduce the dog bite numbers in Detroit 30%, and they were able to stand up and deliver a reform in our animal control facility that took us from being a place where 14% of the dogs that came into our facility came out alive to a place where 71% of the animals that came into our facility left alive. And they did that. We changed leadership, we changed facilities, sure. But it was those workers, because we finally stood up and dignified them as such, made sure that they were earning a living wage in that one job, they were able to turn that around. So I'll always stand with unions, both because they are the #1 tool that working people have to stand up to these big corporations, and also as somebody who is responsible in management, right? Because union labor is better labor. And so what does that mean to me very specifically? #1, we will find every single way forward to take on right to work. What does that mean? That means either we go after legislation if we are able to flip the House and move the Senate in a real way, or we give it to a vote of the people and make sure that the people get to decide about whether or not we want to repeal right to work. Or we're going to make sure to work with, hopefully, a Democratic Attorney General to be able to issue a lawsuit in federal courts to be able to take this on. Those are my commitments around right to work. Prevailing wage. Look, we just saw what happened with prevailing wage. I will fight tooth and nail. And one of the reasons why is because prevailing wage is not just about wage. It's also about worksite safety. They do not believe in civil servants' right to collectively bargain. And they've chipped away at that right over and over and over again. As somebody who has worked in government leadership and worked with unions representing folks working in the state and the city civil service, I will stand up with civil servants in the state every single day to make sure they feel empowered and they feel respected and they know that their right to collectively bargain will not be taken away from them by the very governor they work under. And so those 3 commitments to me are critical and start on day 1 of my administration.
Thank you. For a closing statement?
Yeah. So I want to talk about our future in the context of this election. I've got an uncle who voted for Donald Trump. For most people, that's like, yeah, I've got an uncle who voted for Donald Trump too, but if you look at me and you look at my name, you're like, wow, you've got an uncle that voted for Donald Trump. My stepmom, Jackie, was born and raised in a place called Gratiot County, Michigan. And her family has been in this part of the world since before the Revolutionary War. And my Uncle Rick on that side is one of my favorite uncles in the world. He is an incredible human being. He was the guy who would take us snowmobiling in the winters, take us water skiing in the summers. He learned how to prepare venison halal so that my family could eat it. But in 2008, he was faced with a lot of financial hardship. And he had to lay off workers from the trucking company that he had built. And these are people whose families relied on him for the job that he gave the breadwinner. And since 2008, he has watched as our labor participation rate has stagnated and real wages have fallen for people in his community in the middle of the state of Michigan. And so he voted for Donald Trump. Now you got to imagine the awkward conversation he and his Muslim American nephew had. But the fact is that I don't really begrudge him his vote, because he was between a rock and a hard place. He had one person who wouldn't go into his community, who was telling him that the economy was back. He had another person who was going to communities like him and telling him that you have a right to be angry. Now his solution to it was crazy, right? But at least he said, you have a right to be upset. We as a party have a lot of evolving to do, because we're in a position right now where we want to have our cake and eat it too. We want to talk about the challenges that working people face and about how we're going to stand up for working people, and at the same time we want to take campaign contributions from the same corporations and keep them down. We want to talk about how the economy is not great, but we don't want to talk about solutions, about how we fix that economy, and we don't want to go into communities and have real, honest listening sessions to understand how that economic decline has affected people. And so, while I deeply disagree with everything that Donald Trump has to say, I understand why a lot of people felt like they did not have a great choice. Our job in 2018 is to speak to the challenges that people in our state face. Now, we've got an opportunity to have those conversations, to listen, to empower solutions to the challenges that Michiganders face, to recognize that if and when I'm elected, I will be governor for every single Michigander, and that my responsibility will be to build so that they and their children have the best access to the best possible life. Now here's the thing. People like Donald Trump don't think that people like me should even have access to this country, right? And if we're going to win this race, it's going to be because we play on our front foot. We don't play not to lose, we play to win. We are having honest conversations about the politics that need to change and empower real solutions to real problems, because we are not continuing to take money from the same corporations who benefit from the status quo. And if we want to win this race, we need candidates who are able to have real conversations with those folks because they've listened, and we have to be able to pull out our base. I want you to think about in November of 2018, after we all have made the decision to move beyond what happened in 2016, we will have gone as a state from electing Donald Trump President of the United States to having elected a 33-year-old Muslim American doctor governor. A lot of folks want to send a message to Donald Trump. As I've always said, I'm kind of like a big middle finger to Donald Trump. But the way we do it is to have the conversations, to listen, to learn, to empathize, to take what people are telling us and ask, how do we turn it into policy that makes people's lives better, right? We can win this election, but we can't win this election if we're playing not to lose. We can win this election if we're playing to win, if we are honest, empathic, thoughtful, and we're delivering solutions to the challenges that Michiganders, like my uncle, and like the folks like Demarius, a little 3-year-old boy that I got to serve at the health department in Detroit. If we are building solutions that benefit both of those people, if we are pulling people because of the strength of our message, that's how we win this election. I look forward to doing it together in 2018. Thank you.